Our first community conversation will focus on the importance of sustained US and global advocacy and the role of community voices. Our panelists are Nabeeha Kazi Hutchins, Craig Lasher, Senior Fellow at PAI, and Rebecca Dennis, PAI's Associate Director of US Policy and Advocacy. I'm going to go ahead and start with Rebecca. Can you tell us what is PAI's contribution to the US and global SRHR advocacy space? Or in other words, what does PAI do?
Thanks so much, Katie, and thank you everyone for joining us today. One of our core bodies of work at PAI is advocacy with the US government and global institutions, such as the United Nations and the World Bank, to increase funding to support sexual and reproductive health and rights around the world. In particular, our US government advocacy seeks to have the US increase the amount of foreign assistance funding that our government provides for family planning and reproductive health around the world, and to create a policy environment that bolsters and advances family planning. At PAI, we regularly engage with members of Congress through activities such as meetings and briefings, often focused on the US appropriations process, which determines at what levels the US will fund our bilateral family planning programs, as well as multilateral institutions such as UNFPA. We also work with members of Congress to help support and shape relevant legislation on sexual and reproductive health and rights, global health, and gender equality. Additionally, we work with the Biden-Harris administration and various US executive branch departments and agencies to provide them with information, detailed policy analysis, and recommendations that can inform US strategies and policies. It also ensures that those inside the system have the knowledge needed to become champions for sexual and reproductive health within their agencies. Additionally, we know that the US is a huge player on the global stage and has a tremendous amount of influence. So we seek to address how the US shows up in its engagement with global institutions. So for example, this week we've been closely following the US government's work at the UN Commission on Population and Development and communicating with US government officials regularly, who we were thrilled to see this week embrace sexual and reproductive health and rights, bodily autonomy, and comprehensive sexuality education, and in their opening statement to that body. Though we're always looking to build strong allies within the government, we do not hesitate to hold our own government accountable for their policies and actions, or inactions as the case may be sometimes, that fail to consider, prioritize, or in the worst case scenarios, harm sexual and reproductive health and rights.
Thanks, Rebecca. Craig, can you speak to some of the US government policies that PAI and our peers have been advocating to change or enhance, and where's the sector netting out on those?
Well, Rebecca's already mentioned some of them, but I will go through them with a little bit more detail. So PAI and our coalition partners have essentially been fighting over the same set of issues related to international family planning and reproductive health programs of the US government since the mid-1980s. That is to say, more bilateral funding through the US Agency for International Development, a robust contribution to the UN Population Fund, and a permanent legislative repeal of the global gag rule. Advocates more recently have sought to make progress on removing some longstanding obstacles to comprehensive sexual and reproductive health and rights, like the 1973 Helms Amendment. It's hard to believe that the Biden-Harris administration was inaugurated only a little more than a year ago. It's important to remember and appreciate the major steps that President Biden took to reverse much of the damage inflicted on the program by the last administration. As one of his first official acts, President Biden issued a memorandum rescinding the global gag rule, as well as committing to restoring US funding to UNFPA, which had been denied funding for the previous 4 years, and for the first time for a US president, using the term sexual and reproductive health and rights and pledging his administration's support for it both at home and abroad through increased funding and more progressive policies. PAI and our coalition partners actively campaigned for these positive actions as part of the process of creating a transition blueprint provided to the incoming administration. It's important to remember that which party is in the majority in Congress and who sits in the White House determines the fate of US funding and policy issues each year. The debate plays out in the annual must-pass State Department and Foreign Operations Appropriations Bill. With Democrats in charge of both chambers on Capitol Hill and President Biden in the White House, the stars finally seemed to be aligned last year, and advocates were poised to enact a permanent legislative repeal of the gag rule to prevent a future Republican president from reinstating the policy with the stroke of a pen. Unfortunately, the Democratic majorities in Congress are extremely narrow, and due to the unrelenting demands of anti-SRHR legislators on the Republican side of the aisle, the bill ended up defaulting to the prior year's funding level and policy, essentially retaining the status quo, which has persisted on these issues for more than a decade, actually a dozen years at this point. Looking forward, the arrival of the president's budget request at the end of March has kickstarted the appropriations process for the upcoming year, and we'll be fighting over the same issues once again. But the budget's late arrival and the start of campaigning for the midterm congressional elections in November will complicate this year's process. Despite these challenges, PAI and its allies will be pushing Congress to approve not only the vital financial resources that the Biden administration has proposed, but also the policy changes that will be needed to reestablish US leadership in advancing SRHR around the world.
Thanks so much, Craig. Rebecca and Nabeeha, are there other global efforts and even countries where bold actions are already underway? Rebecca, would you like to go first?
Absolutely. It's now been a little over 25 years since the International Conference on Population and Development and the Beijing Women's Conference, which really sought to change how we were addressing issues like sexual and reproductive health and women's empowerment in the global community, and really sought to put rights at the center of the discussion, as well as equity and equality. In that time period, in the decades since, we've only seen that continue to grow. We now see specific targets around sexual and reproductive health and rights, girls' education, child marriage, and gender-based violence as part of the 2030 Agenda on the Sustainable Development Goals. The US itself, for the first time, has developed a national strategy on gender equity and equality that looks at these issues both from a national perspective here in the United States, as well as a global one. And critically, that strategy recognizes sexual and reproductive health as one of its core pillars, which was something that we strongly advocated for with the White House when they came into office. Additionally, there's been a much greater focus now on how development activities are funded and who is being funded. We've seen the US really hone in on wanting to directly support more local organizations. This has been a big focus of Samantha Powers, who heads up the US Agency for International Development. We're also increasingly seeing a push towards more domestic resource mobilization to support sexual and reproductive health in low and middle income countries. This is critical for not only securing in-country buy-in and prioritization, but also can help to decrease reliance on US foreign assistance funds. Although we know that the US is really a leader in this space and is the largest contributor to US global health, that money also comes with a lot of strings attached to it. It can be complicated by often harmful policies that organizations have to subscribe to, including the Helms Amendment or the Global Gag Rule, as Craig mentioned. So those efforts to really move off of complete reliance upon the US will be really critical in the years and decades ahead. Nabeeha?
Thanks, Rebecca, and Katie, thanks for the question. Just to complement with what Rebecca has so beautifully already stated and lifted up, I think, there are three big initiatives and efforts that I think certainly affect our sector and our space, and that we have our eyes on. Of course, PAI has made some commitments to these as well and engaged. But first is last year's Generation Equality Forum, a big push around achieving gender equality, some bold and courageous and big commitments by donors as well as by countries and civil society, including PAI, on how we are going to advance gender equality around the world. And it is approaching a year in June from when those commitments were made. And I think just having a look at that and making sure that we're holding ourselves accountable as well as each other, and as well as governments. And that's an important role for civil society to play as well, to look at that broader landscape and say, how are we tracking against that? Are we making progress? Are we doing the kinds of things that we said we would do? Is funding being deployed at the level that it said it would be deployed? And also, ultimately, are we improving outcomes as they relate to the rights and equality and equity of communities? The second one is FP 2030. And this is Family Planning 2030, which builds off of FP 2020. And national governments are making their own commitments to family planning, building off of the FP 2020 commitments, as well as such incredible commitments from civil society, from international NGOs, and from other institutions that are ready to say, okay, we've got a little under a decade to get the job done for the things that we promised and that we committed to on advancing family planning and ensuring access. And that goes beyond ensuring that the goods are in the health services and health systems. It also involves having domestic resources to fund that, and also that we're driving demand and ensuring that communities know that family planning services and contraceptives are available to them and accessible to them, and they'll get them with compassion and with kindness. And then the third is the global financing facility and the commitments around the GFF. Really, the GFF about a decade ago was launched as a pooled fund mechanism from different sources. And the focus was to advance maternal, child, and newborn health and well-being. The GFF, again, heavy collaboration with national governments, but also recognizes the role of civil society, of a range of institutions to help advance those commitments and ensure that those commitments stick. I think all of this is really exciting, and I'm sure there are many more, but this is really exciting for our sector as we rebalance the scales a little bit and also infuse our movement and the funding for universal access to SRHR with the diversity of sources. Yes, we need the international community absolutely to step up. We need the US government to pay their fair share into this. We need other governments to do the same. We're so appreciative of the donors who really led the charge on this. But there's also a space here for domestic resource mobilization, which we are seeing as an important strategy at country level, especially to mitigate the potential challenges and harms that come about with pivots in strategy, with pivots in country priorities, with pivots in the preferences of political administrations. So all of this is really great to have that bigger space, not only for voice, but expanding the space on who finances and therefore who decides.
Thank you so much. And finally, to each of you, what do you think is needed to advance USG and global advocacy? We'll go ahead and start with Nabeeha, Craig, and then Rebecca to close us out.
Well, I'm always going to talk about money. So I'm going to start with that. Is we need sustained and flexible investment for advocacy across the board at the global level, at the US level, and that's not merely in times of crisis, right? Or when key administrations might come in and view other priorities as essential. What we need is the sustained, flexible funding so we can ensure that the evidence and data sharing is not a one and done, that it is constant, that we are building, that we can have that engagement with staffers on the Hill, that we can engage with newly elected members of Congress who we know could champion our cause, but may not be fully on board because they don't have all the information, and there are a lot of other pressing needs. I think also having this conversation, even with members of Congress who may not come out publicly to support our cause, but need to be aware of the impact and the implications of policy in the US that hurts and that harms women and communities and young people. So that funding is essential, and the funding to advocates needs to be there. So advocates can count on the ability to do their work, to drive an advocacy agenda for SRHR in a manner that is highly flexible and that's highly responsive to the needs. The second thing I will highlight, and then I'd love to kick it over to you, Craig, is thinking about how do we expand our engagement in the US as US advocates? As I mentioned, PAI was formed to advocate to the US and on the global stage. What other voices are there? We've been talking a lot about what happened in FY 2022, in the FY 2022 budget, where there were great opportunities to expand the US commitment to advancing reproductive health, and for once and for all, eradicating very harmful policies that hurt women abroad. And hopefully we could have repealed, like the global gag rule, permanently. It didn't happen. And we understand why. It's still painful to see. And so we say, well, who else should come to the table? Is there an opportunity for grassroots at the US state level for us to mobilize young people, for us to mobilize college students, for us to mobilize other women who are going to engage at the state level with their elected officials to say, you know what, we need to ensure that the decisions that the US make don't do harm, and have this army and this expansive group of voices here in the US that can amplify to elected officials in the US, but also on the global stage, and carry that drumbeat forward. But I'm going to hand it over to Craig, one of our resident experts on this, to see what he has to say.
Thanks, Nabeeha. So in addition to try and mobilize new allies here in the United States to contact their members of Congress and the White House, as you heard earlier in the discussion of the new strategic plan, PAI is recommitting to lifting up the voices of our partners in the field and hearing from communities about the local impact of US policies and funding, and elevating their perspectives in the media. We seek to learn about their priorities and how US family planning reproductive assistance might be made better to serve the needs of the people that they seek to assist. These efforts have a long history at PAI, back to the time when we were a pioneer in arranging congressional study tours in which members of Congress and their staffs were provided the opportunity to see firsthand the work of organizations delivering family planning and reproductive health services in countries receiving US assistance. A number of the strongest SRHR champions on Capitol Hill today are alumni of these study tours. Once overseas travel again becomes possible, it would be great to explore the reinstituting these study tours. As we used to say, seeing is believing, and there's nothing like taking a member of Congress and their staff to the field to see the benefits of US investments in these programs. Perhaps one of the silver linings of the pandemic is the development of an increasing availability of video conferencing technology like the Zoom platform that we're using today. This presents potential new opportunities for valuable expert perspectives from the field to be brought to policy dialogues with Congress, USAID, and other executive branch agencies without the large investment of time and the expense of flying into town for meetings and briefings that are of short duration. So I'll turn it over to Rebecca now.
Thanks so much, Craig and Nabeeha. From my perspective, one of the things that I believe is most critical to advancing USG and global advocacy is having a seat at diverse tables that allow us to highlight the intersectionality of sexual and reproductive health and rights, which is something that PAI is very well positioned to do. We know that if we want to talk about achieving gender equity, we need to talk about how early pregnancy is a barrier to girls' education, to discuss how child marriage is a violation of girls' rights, to make the connection between access to family planning and women's economic and civic participation, as well as their ability to contributing to ending poverty in their families and communities. Similarly, with so many impacted or displaced by climate change or other natural disasters, and numerous conflicts that we're seeing around the world, like those happening right now in Ukraine and Yemen, ensuring access to family planning, maternal health, and gender-based violence services from the onset of a crisis is absolutely vital. That's why PAI has made commitments to these sort of big global initiatives that Nabeeha was talking about, like generation equality, and why we seek to advance reproductive, maternal, newborn, and child health with our GFF work. It's why we've taken on leadership roles here in DC, not only with the International Family Planning Coalition, but coalitions like Girls Not Brides USA, and why we participate in efforts like the Call to Action on GBV and Emergencies and the Interagency Working Group on Reproductive Health and Crises, both of which seek to transform the way that gender-based violence and sexual and reproductive health is addressed in humanitarian emergencies. For me, the gender equality and humanitarian piece is always at the front of my mind because it is what so much of my individual work focuses on. But I'd be remiss if I didn't mention how PAI is also working to engage with the broader global health community, particularly around HIV and maternal health. And those connections in that broader health space have been absolutely crucial, both back during the Trump administration when we were fighting against the global gag rule, and that provided us with a number of strong allies across civil society, as well as, of course, now as we're all facing the COVID-19 pandemic together. Additionally, just to close us out on this front, the one other thing that I would say is that it is critically important that we continue to expand the ecosystem of champions and advocates. This has to include not only continuing to build allies within the US and other governments, but also looking at community activists around the globe and experts in the field who can share evidence from their lived experience, who can help to advance calls to action and hold decision makers accountable, whether here in the US or in countries around the world. So I think that's probably a good place for me to end off there, Katie, and I think should flow nicely into our next piece of discussion.